has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Townsville has experienced our worst natural disaster in our recorded history. The devastating flood has affected more than 22,000 homes. Why won't the Prime Minister schedule extra sitting days so this parliament can pass laws to make insurance companies treat North Queenslanders fairly? When will the Prime Minister stop listening to the insurers and start listening to the people of North Queensland?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question about the Townsville floods and the floods more generally, I think, Mr Speaker, that has affected North Queensland. I appreciate the member's interest in this issue, and it's been several days now since we've been back in the parliament, so I welcome the question from the member. The ministerial task force, which is focused on the rebuilding and reconstruction and recovery for North Queensland, was convened on Monday evening. That ministerial task force is overseeing the government's continued response to the flood crisis in northern Queensland. I particularly want to commend all those in the Department of Human Services who have supported some $90 million worth of payments which have been expedited to ensure that people in Townsville have been getting that emergency support that they so desperately need. We moved immediately to remove and extend some of the eligibility requirements for those emergency payments, and that ensured that within days, almost immediately, those payments were flowing. I was pleased to be able to visit Townsville very soon after the floods and meet with the Mayor and the other crisis workers there and the other emergency services workers, and I commend them on the incredible work they've been doing. Now, we will stand with all of those in North Queensland, as we have in both the immediate response, during the recovery phase and in the rebuilding phase into the future. And I want to thank the Queensland Government for the excellent relationship we've had, working closely with them. So not a day will pass without my government doing every single thing that is needed to support the people of North Queensland. Every single day. And I can only say that if the member was so concerned about the financial support that we provided, Mr Speaker—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left, the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, the question goes to insurance and the Prime Minister is yet to refer to it.
The members on my right, before I call the Prime Minister, I'm not going to keep repeating myself. The question was about insurance, and other matters were mentioned in the course of that question, and the Prime Minister is being relevant to all of the words that were in the question. And again, I just caution members, if they're going to complain about that, the words just should be a question. Leave the commentary out of it. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. But specifically on the matter of insurance, that is one of the many issues that the government is dealing with as part of the ministerial task force in our response to the flood crisis in northern Queensland. And the Assistant Treasurer has been working on those issues, and I can assure you that the insurance companies are on notice from our government that they need to address the claims and they need to be standing with the people of North Queensland in the same way that our government is doing just that, Mr Speaker. I'm very disappointed that the government has been put in the situation where we have to spend $500 million in the next 2 years opening a detention centre, which we didn't need to do 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker. And the only reason we have to do that is because the Leader of the Labor Party has no ticker on border protection.
The member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on action the government is taking to build a stronger and more secure Australia? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dunkley. Our government has been and will continue to build a stronger Australia, Mr Speaker. That is our record, the reduction in unemployment, the record jobs creation under this government, and the investment at record levels into hospitals and into schools and affordable medicines, all of this made possible by a stronger economy, and the record is plain to see on the strength of Australia under the stewardship of our government. And we have the clear plans to keep it that way, and the Leader of the Labor Party wants to change it all, Mr Speaker. But one thing that our government is absolutely united on, Mr Speaker, is the need to put these plans in place to ensure that we continue with the strong economic management and the plans that we have outlined to keep Australia stronger into the future. And we are united in our opposition to the Labor Party's plans, who will make Australia weaker if they get the opportunity, Mr Speaker. We're united on lower taxes. We're united on supporting small and family businesses. We're united on carrying all of our traditional industries forward together with our new industries. That includes our mining and resource industries. That includes our forestry industries. That includes our agricultural sector, Mr Speaker. We are united in our support for a stronger economy, because that's what guarantees the essential services that Australians rely on. And we're united, Mr Speaker, on keeping Australians safe and secure and ensuring that we have the border security measures in place, Mr Speaker. That's what we're united on doing together to ensure that we have a stronger Australia. But I can tell you, the Labor Party not so united on these things, Mr Speaker. What we heard today was the AWU's legend, Bill Ludwig, up in Queensland, calling out the Labor Party on the divisions in the Labor Party when it comes to support for our traditional industries in this country and the resources sector. And the member for Corio came right in on cue, Mr Speaker, describing as wonderful, Mr Speaker, a global market collapse that supports Australia's biggest mining export industry, that supports 55,000 jobs. That is what the member for Corio has said about those jobs, Mr Speaker. Well, he might think it's wonderful, Mr Speaker, but I can tell you on this side of the House we don't think it's wonderful. In all of those places that depend on those jobs, Mr Speaker, they don't think it's wonderful, Mr Speaker. And I can't hear the member for Shortland's interjections, I can't hear the member for Patterson's interjections, or the member for Hunter's interjections, or the member for Herbert's interjections when it comes to supporting the traditional industries of this country, Mr Speaker. This is a Labor Party that's divided on economic policy and divided on border policy. One day saying it's not fine for Christmas Island, the next day to say it is fine for Christmas Island, and now we have the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party conflicting with their own leader.
The member for Gorton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday in question time, the Prime Minister said that both Minister Cash and the Human Services Minister cooperated with the Australian Federal Police investigation about a leaked police raid. But the police told estimates they asked ministers for witness statements on at least 2 separate occasions, but none were provided. Who's telling the truth, the Prime Minister or the police? Because both can't be correct.
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, there's another option, and that is the member who asked the question is not representing the truth of these proceedings, Mr Speaker, which is no surprise whatsoever. Because, as I said yesterday, at no stage after the statements that were requested by the AFP and that was provided, I'm advised that further innovation advice that the statement was provided was insufficient, Mr Speaker. And what I can tell you is that the AFP has acknowledged the receipt of both the correspondence from the Minister Keenan and from Minister Cash. And in relation to Minister Keenan, he said, "I acknowledge receipt of your statement. AFP investigators will review the statement, and if we require any further clarification, we may reach out to you." That was the end of the matter, Mr Speaker. My ministers have fully cooperated. My ministers cooperated with the requirements of the AFP, and the
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Gorton on a point of order. I'm struggling to
On direct relevance,
understand.
Speaker.
Okay, the member for Gorton will resume his seat. Member for Gorton will resume his seat. There is no point of order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the simple explanation is this. The AFP contacted the ministers responded, and no further information was sought from the ministers.
The member for Gorton seeking to table a document.
I'm seeking leave to table the comments by the Deputy Commissioner where she says, no, I would not classify that as a witness statement.
You don't have to read them out. Is leave granted? I believe he's not granted. The member for Dawson.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the risks and opportunity costs to regional Australia from weakening Australia's borders and not standing up for jobs?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dawson for his question, Mr Speaker. A question from somebody who supports Central and North Queensland jobs, Mr Speaker. And I tell you who else supports North and Queensland jobs, Mr Speaker, the member for Flynn, the member for Capricornia, the member for Leichhardt, Mr Speaker. They support Queensland jobs. The
Deputy Prime Minister, if you just pause for a second. The member for McEwen is interjecting consistently. Just cease your interjections, OK? It's like a never-ending whippersnipper. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
More jobs, like members on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. There are any number of members who don't support jobs on that side of the House. And you know what? The AWU President, former President Bill Ludwig, has called them out this morning. Called them out. He wants them to support Queensland jobs. That's what he wants, Mr Speaker. The member for Dawson asked me about the borders, Mr Speaker. We on this side of the House are strong on borders. Those on that side are not. They opened 19 detention centres, Mr Speaker. We closed them, Mr Speaker. Labor wasted $16 billion on its weak border policies. $16 billion. The Mackay Ring Road in the member for Dawson's electorate costs $800 million. Mr Speaker, imagine what else we could build with $16,000 million. The opposition leader, he says one thing when he's campaigning in Mackay, another when he's in Moorabbin. He says one thing when he's in Townsville and the member for Herbert's electorate. He says another thing when he's in Toorak, Mr Speaker. People of Queensland do not trust the member for Maribyrnong. And I tell you what, nor do a lot of other people either. Does he support Queensland jobs or does he not? I think he does not. Mr Speaker, the member for Dawson certainly supports workers. Just today, Mr Speaker, we heard an extraordinary contribution from the member for Corio. The member for Corio, the Shadow Minister for Defence, who said that an end to our biggest export earner, a $66 billion export industry, Mr Speaker, would be wonderful and a good thing. 55,000 workers in that industry, and he does not support them. He thinks that them losing their jobs would be a wonderful thing. Shame on him, Mr Speaker. Absolute shame on him. The member for Dawson knows just how important those workers are. He knows. Mr Speaker, how on earth are we going to pay for the tanks, for the submarines, if we lose that sort of export earner? The member for Corio should understand that. He should know that. Mr Speaker, when Labor were in power with their weak border protection policies, Mr Speaker, they did not commission one ship, not one ship for defence. Mr Speaker, it wasn't that they were against ships, Mr Speaker. It wasn't that as though they were against ships. My goodness, they let 800 of them arrive on our shores. They let 800 of them, it's not as if they were against ships. How on earth are we going to pay for defence investment, protect defence jobs, if we don't have an export earning industry paying $66 billion, Mr Speaker? Shame on him. The member for Dawson supports jobs in Queensland. The member for Corio does not.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister was asked whether all his ministers had fully complied with the ministerial standards in all of their dealings with Mr Andrew Burns and Hello World. The Prime Minister answered, and I quote, "I'm advised there's nothing before me that could conflict with the question that the member just put to me." Prime Minister, is that still the case?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is still the case, Mr Speaker, and I'm not going to take lectures from the Leader of the Labor Party, who it took 8 years to disclose the campaign support he got from unions when he first ran for the parliament, Mr Speaker. I'm not going to take lectures from a bloke, Mr Speaker, who won't even cooperate with the police when it comes to taking money out of union members' pockets and giving it to Get Up and himself. I'm not going to be lectured by this bloke, Mr Speaker.
Get the answer out of Bill.
Just before I call the member for Melbourne, if the Leader of the House could cease interjecting, and the member for Isaacs again, I'd like to inform the House we have joining us in the chamber this afternoon a parliamentary delegation led by the first Vice-President of the National Parliament of Timor-Leste. On behalf of the House, extend a very warm welcome to you. And we also have joining us a parliamentary delegation from Kenya, joined by the Kenyan High Commissioner to Australia. Can I also extend a very warm welcome to you? And I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, the Deputy Prime Minister. Climate change poses massive risks to Australia's infrastructure, including from rising sea levels, floods that are more intense and bushfires like we've already seen this year. Deputy Prime Minister, will you join me in congratulating the courageous school students going on strike on 15th of March right around the country, calling for urgent climate action and the protection of Australia's infrastructure? Will you commend these young people and the 15,000 who went on strike last November for taking time off school to show us what real leadership looks like?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I tell you what, real leadership doesn't look like anything that the member for Melbourne ever brings to this chamber, Mr Speaker. The children should be at school. That's where they should be. They should be learning about Australian history. They should be learning about Australian geography. They should be learning about all the lessons that their teachers are willing to teach them. Mr Speaker, they should be at school. They should be at school, and I'm pleased that I'm part of a government which is spending record funding on schools,
for Kingston
Mr Speaker.
is warned.
Record funding on public schools, record funding on schools in general, Mr Speaker. And the member for Melbourne would do far better off, Mr Speaker, advising those children to go to school and to stay at school. What would happen, Who's going to look after those kids when they're out protesting? I know the Greens like to protest because that's all you ever bring to the national debate is protests and frivolous rallies. You do far better off joining the Liberal and the National parties in talking about the economic narrative, in talking about how important it is to have a job in this country, because if you want to work in this country, well, there's a job there for you. You'd be far better off talking about our record investment in defence and not siding with those on that side who, when they had 6 years of opportunity, dropped our defence investment spending levels to 1.6% of GDP, down to the same levels of appeasement. And I don't know why the member for Greenway's complaining or laughing. I mean, it's no laughing matter. It's important that we spend money on defence. It's important that our defence people have the very best of equipment. And under your side,
Deputy Prime Minister, just if the member for Melbourne could resume his seat, I'm just going to say the Deputy Prime Minister was asked a question with a number of elements, but straying into defence is not relevant to the question. The member for the Deputy Prime Minister can resume his answer, but he needs to be relevant to the question.
Well, Mr Speaker, the best place for those children is at school, learning about Australian history, learning about all the important things that their teachers, our very best teachers, mind you. You've already had one.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Melbourne on a point of order. I haven't had a point of order yet. I just want to be as efficient as possible. The member for Kingston's been warned, so now's a good time for her to leave under 94A, generally interjecting. And the member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, perhaps the minister might also like to explain what the children should do with the science that they have learnt.
Points of order aren't an opportunity to ask a supplementary question. Members on my right. Member for Dawson is warned. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Been here long enough to know he can't reintroduce new material into a question, so you can't have two goes. You can't have two goes, but I'm proud to be part of a government that invests in teachers, quality teachers. My daughter is a quality teacher, and I tell you what, Mr Speaker, so too are our teachers. And they, you know what? They should be in class. They should be teaching our children, the very best children. And I tell you what, yeah, they're up there too. Well done for pointing them out. Good on you.
The member for Cowan.
Well, I tell you what, I hope they don't learn too many sentences from you, Mr Member for McMahon, because I tell you what, you haven't brought much to the national debate lately. And I tell you what, when they get old, I hope you've still got nothing to do with their franking credits, nothing to do with their negative gearing. The kids should be at school learning all the important things that their teachers are going to teach them.
Members on my left. The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on why it is important to provide older Australians the opportunity to secure financial independence in retirement? And Treasurer, how would a higher taxing approach impact their investments and the revenues of charities?
The Treasurer has the call.
Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question. I want to congratulate him for the excellent work that he's done on the parliamentary inquiry that's looking at franking credits, Mr Speaker, because together with the member for Goldstein and the member for Reid, the member for McKellar, the member for Brisbane and the member for Hughes, they have given an opportunity for more than 1 million Australians who are going to be hit by Labor's retiree tax to be heard, Mr Speaker. And today in Parliament House there was a forum on Labor's retirees tax, organised by the Alliance for a Fairer Retirement, with representatives of National Seniors, COSBOA and others, Mr Speaker. And the disgust of these people with Labor's $55 billion retiree tax, Mr Speaker, a tax that will fall hardest on the lowest income earners in our community, Mr Speaker, over 80% of whom have a taxable income under $37,000, over half of whom are women, Mr Speaker. And we know it's going to affect charities too, Mr Speaker. We know it's going to affect charities too because the Cancer Council of Queensland said 2 of our major donors have advised
Member for Shortland.
have advised the Cancer Council that they are unlikely to be in a position to donate if this policy is introduced due to the deniability of the tax deduction. Now that is in a letter.
Treasurer will pause. Member for Kingston Smith will leave under 94A. I mean, I ask you to cease interjecting. You look at me and keep interjecting. I don't know what you expect me to do. The Treasurer has the call.
Now, Mr Speaker, that is in a letter from the Cancer Council of Queensland is very clear. Now, at today's hearing, there were many stories, including from Norm, who is in his 80s, and his wife Margaret, who he called across the table his sweetheart. And he told the forum that they have contributed all their lives to the community, paying their tax and saving for the retirement. Now they are totally reliant on savings, which provides them with an annual combined income of $60,000. But under Labor, their income will drop to $47,000, a $13,000 hit, Mr Speaker. We will survive, Norm said, but the thing that incenses me is what is happening and how it is happening. Now, Mr Speaker, there's only one side of this Parliament. There is only one side of politics, the Liberal and National parties in government under this Prime Minister, that are standing with retirees, Mr Speaker, that won't tax them into oblivion, that won't break a 20-year consensus on franking credits, that ensures that they can continue with their quality of life. Only the coalition can be relied on to deliver lower taxes.
The Manager of Opposition Business seeking to table a document.
That's right, Mr Speaker. The Treasurer referred to a submission from the Cancer Council in his answer. I seek leave to table their retraction.
Is leave granted? Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today it's been reported that US Ambassador Joe Hockey, who has $1 million shareholding in Hello World, helped a Hello World subsidiary lobby for the embassy's travel contract. How could it possibly be appropriate for Joe Hockey to use his official position as ambassador to help Hello World win a government contract? Why does this Liberal government only ever look after itself and its mates at the top end of town?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm advised Mr Hockey declared his shareholding in Hello World before the tender process for the Australian Embassy in Washington Travel Services commenced.
Prime Minister will pause. Members on my left will cease interjecting. I think those interjecting behind the front bench may not realise they're actually preventing their own front bench hearing the answer and me hearing the answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The tender process commenced with the register for expressions of interest advertised in August of 2018. Mr Hockey has had no role in the tender process. He has declared his business interests in accordance with DFAT guidelines. So, Mr Speaker, this is just another grubby attempt by the Labor Party to distract attention from one very simple thing. They know they have made a very big mistake in showing up the weakness of their own leader by forcing him to back down.
Prime Minister will pause. The member for Cowan's warned, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition's warned, and once again so is the member for Gellibrand. Prime Minister has the call.
Forcing the Labor leader to back down to them and come into this place and weaken Australia's border security arrangements. And they can come in here and they can throw all the mud they like, but one thing will be known well outside the Canberra bubble is that when it comes to border protection, you can't trust Labor, Mr Speaker. You cannot trust Labor, and I'll tell you why, is because they are so divided on the issue of border protection. This is why they failed so badly in government. They could not agree on this issue from one day to the next, and that's why you can't trust Labor.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of maintaining Australia's strong and consistent border protection policies? Is the minister aware of any threats to the continued success of Operation Sovereign Borders, which I know personally has been so successful?
The member for Home Affairs, Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Gilmore. And, Mr Speaker, in her electorate, people are concerned about border protection, and she makes that very good point. In fact, as you move around the country, Mr Speaker, Australians want strong border protection policies, but they understand from the Labor Party they have a very, very weak alternative. Now, the Leader of the Opposition quite often turns his back in question time when he doesn't want to hear what's being said, but he needs to hear this, Mr Speaker, because I note in the media in the last 24 hours that the justification by the Leader of the Opposition for not nominating a shadow Minister for Home Affairs is firstly because the member for Blair is incapable of fulfilling the position. That is true. That is very abundantly clear to people on both sides of the House. I think we can agree on that. He is one of the architects of the disaster of the last week or so. He was for Christmas Island. He was against Christmas Island. He's hopeless. Let's just put that to one side. But who could fulfil the job if he's not able or capable to do it? The member for Corio, I mean, he once showed some interest in this space, but he has demonstrated in the last few hours that he doesn't want this job, and he wants 55,000 Queenslanders not to have a job either, Mr Speaker. It's an outrage. So who would you turn to? I mean, who would be the Minister for Home Affairs? Who would be in control of Operation Sovereign Borders if the Labor Party was elected in May? Well, Mr Speaker, there are a couple on the short list. Because they've done the job before. Let's see how their track record went, Mr Speaker. So you had the member for McMahon, 398 votes on his watch, 25,000 people arrived. Would you shortlist him for the job? I wouldn't have thought so. What about who else is on this list? What about the member for Watson, our old favourite? He's there whispering away, pretending to talk about anything other than this. He had 83 votes. He had 83 votes on his watch, and 6,600 people under his watch. 1,100 children went into detention. Mr Speaker, the position of the Labor Party deteriorates every single day. You know what they're proposing at the moment? They're proposing that people of bad character can come to our country. We have no power under Labor's law to prevent the transfer of a man accused of conducting a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl on Manus Island. He comes here under the Labor proposal. At the time we're kicking out criminals, the Labor Party is bringing people in with questionable criminal backgrounds, Mr Speaker. We have no power to prevent the transfer of a man charged with 4 counts of sexual penetration of a minor, and the list goes on and on and on, and he should be condemned.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm reports that US Ambassador Joe Hockey was contacted by Hello World CEO and Liberal Party Treasurer Andrew Burns? Mr Hockey then directed embassy staff to meet with a Hello World subsidiary to discuss the embassy's travel arrangements, and the embassy staff were not aware of Joe Hockey's interest in Hello World until after that meeting had taken place. Is the Prime Minister seriously telling the Australian people that this behaviour is completely acceptable.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, again the member is misrepresenting the truth. He does this constantly. His mentor up there misrepresented the truth when he said he was going to live with 4 surpluses, Mr Speaker, and they turned out to be deficits. The Prince of Deficits is leaving the chamber, Mr Speaker. Sadly, he's leaving the chamber, but I wish him all the best in his retirement. Mr Speaker, I can advise that the Australian Embassy staff meeting on the 26th of April 2017, I'm advised, was not in relation to the tender process. QBT was then and continues to be a travel provider for DFAT through a whole-of-government supply arrangement. Mr Hockey declared his business interests in Hello World to Embassy staff ahead of the meeting. I'm advised Mr Hockey did not instruct staff to meet QBT or any other companies in relation to the tender, and as part of normal business, Australian Embassy staff have met and corresponded with a wide range of travel providers to discuss the Embassy's travel requirements. So, Mr Speaker, what this is just again is the Labor Party trying to distract attention with all these slurs, all these smears, all these grubby claims, Mr Speaker, because they know they have been caught out doing the wrong thing by the Australian people, and well outside this bubble here, Mr Speaker, whether it's out in Penrith or up in Townsville or over in Bunbury, they know one thing, and that is the Labor Party cannot be trusted on border protection because the leader of the Labor Party is a weak soul when it comes to this issue, Mr Speaker. He cannot be trusted, and his party is riven and divided on the issue of border protection. Only today we had the Deputy Leader of the Opposition agreeing with the member for Wentworth, who had said, and now I wouldn't suggest the member for Wentworth take geography lessons from the member for Sydney, Mr Speaker, that said that these people should not come to Christmas Island, they should come to Australia, Mr Speaker. They shouldn't come to Christmas Island, they should come to Australia. Now, I can see the member for Sydney agrees with that, Mr Speaker, but honestly, they should be taken to a place, Mr Speaker, where we can be sure that any persons who come to this place who shouldn't be are held in detention.
The member for Barton, I just say to the Prime Minister, and he's now concluded his answer to the question, he's entitled to compare and contrast with a question, but to then stay on other subject matter is not in order, and that's why it wasn't really for your benefit, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I didn't have you at all in mind. I was talking about the relevance of the Prime Minister's answer, and that's why on a couple of occasions I've called the Prime Minister just as it happened, winding up the answer. But I'm just flagging that now. The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister outline to the House how Australia's resource sector is supporting jobs in Queensland, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that would put at risk the jobs created by the Australian resources exports?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question. It is a very nice tie, thank you. Mr Speaker, last year Australia recorded a $22.2 billion trade surplus. In fact, the largest trade surplus Australia has ever achieved in a single calendar year. And in fact, it's a consequence of the free trade agreements that the Liberal National Government put in place. And in fact, a key contributor to this record surplus was an increase in resource exports. And we saw thermal coal provided and produced a record $23 billion worth of export income for Australia. And the great news is that this record exports has been terrific for jobs. In Queensland, in the resources sector in our state, it's created over 10,000 jobs over the past year. That represents one new job every 40 minutes that's been created from resource sector's exports. And I know that everyone on this side of the chamber support those resource sector jobs. But unfortunately, not everyone on that side of the chamber does, Mr Speaker. And in fact, the member for Leichhardt asked me about alternative approaches. Well, we see some alternative approaches. We saw this morning the member for Corio had views about his alternative approach and that of the Australian Labor Party. And he said the global market for thermal coal has collapsed. And wonderful. That's a good thing. The Australian Labor Party thinks it's a good thing that they can throw in the junk pile 55,000 jobs in the resources sector. Move over, member for Hunter. There's a brand new cheerleader in town for the demise of resource jobs, and it's the member for Corio. But we see how divided the Australian Labor Party is and some of their union backers, because we saw the CFMEU demanding Labor candidates pledge support for the coal mining industry. But following this weak leader of the opposition, we saw, in fact, all 13 of Labor's candidates and MPs in Queensland's most marginal seats have all refused to comment, and all of them joined the coalition of silence. So we know that this leader of the opposition is weak on border protection, and we know that he's too divided, too wedged and too weak on resource jobs as well. He won't stand up for jobs in the resources sector, but the coalition certainly will. The member for Herbert, she's part of the coalition of silence. She won't stand up for workers in her electorate, but I tell you what, LNP candidate Phyllis Thompson will. He will. The Labor candidate for Capricornia, despite being a member of the CFMEU, won't stand up for workers in that electorate. But I tell you what, the member for Capricornia will stand up for those workers, and the Labor candidate for Dawson won't stand up for workers in that electorate. But the member for Dawson will stand up for all of those employees. The fact is, Labor's approach will see fewer jobs.
The member for Wakefield.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister.
Members on my right.
Yesterday,
just pause. Just member for Wakefield will pause. Just for members on my right. I want to hear the question. Members on my right. The member for Wakefield has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, it was revealed the Finance Minister received free flights to Singapore from Hello World just before it was awarded a multi-million-dollar whole-of-government contract by the minister's own department. And today it was reported that US Ambassador Joe Hockey, who has $1 million shareholding in Hello World, helped a Hello World subsidiary lobby for embassy travel contract. Is the Prime Minister confident that trips like the one by the Minister for Home Affairs and Joe Hockey with Hello World CEO and Liberal Treasurer—
Member's time has concluded. Member for Wakefield will resume his seat. Does the member for Chifley want to leave before he hears the ruling? Unfortunately, there was no question there. Not on my hearing of it, and the member for Moore resume his seat. Members will cease interjecting. The member for Lilly on a point of order.
Couldn't hear the member when he was asking the question. There was clearly something wrong with the sound, and I believe he should be given the chance to ask it again.
I say to the member for Lilly, I regularly have difficulty hearing the questions because of the members in this chamber, but I could hear it. I could hear it clearly. The member for Lilly.
We could not hear it back here. It was not working.
The member for Moore will resume his— It's all right. I'm not going to forget him. The member for I'm in a generous mood. The member for Wakefield can repeat his question. I'm just going to point out to him that he did sort of, after the 30 seconds, swim underwater for about another 15. So I'll let him repeat what he, in good faith, just read to the House. If it's a different question, I'll sit him down.
It's the same one. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday it was revealed the Finance Minister received free flights to Singapore from Hello World
Members on my right.
Just before it was awarded a whole-of-government contract by the minister's own department. Today, it's been reported that US Ambassador Joe Hockey, who has $1 million shareholding in Hello World, helped Hello World, a Hello World subsidiary, lobby for an embassy contract. Is the Prime Minister confident that trips like the one the Minister for Home Affairs and Joe Hockey and the Hello World CEO—
The member's time has concluded again. Members on my right, the Assistant Treasurer, the Leader of the House. No issue with the microphone there. And again, there was no question. The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government is guaranteeing the economic security of all Australians who have saved for their retirement? Is the Treasurer aware of any risks to these savings posed by higher taxation methods to managing the economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
I thank the member for Moore for his question and congratulate him on being able to ask a question properly.
That's how you do it.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Moore is fighting hard for the more than 6,000 constituents in his electorate who will be affected by Labor's big $55 billion retiree tax, Mr. Speaker. And the constituents in his electorate, like the constituents in electorates across this chamber, Mr. Speaker, could not believe it when the member for McMahon went on the 7:30 report earlier this week, arrogantly dismissing the concerns of more than 1 million Australians and saying that the Labor Party would not change their retiree tax one bit, Mr. Speaker. Not one bit. The member for McMahon said despite all the deep concerns across this country, the Labor Party will ignore those concerns and arrogantly dismiss them, and if the people don't like Labor's retiree tax, well, then don't vote Labor, he says, Mr. Speaker.
Good advice.
Well, the reality is the people who are going to be hit hardest by Labor's retiree tax are those on lower income. Those on lower income. Over 80% have a taxable income under $37,000. And those hardest hit will be women, Mr. Speaker, over half of whom are women and 2/3 of whom are over the age of 60, and about half of whom are either single or widowed. That is the effect of Labor's policy. Now, the Labor Party says that their policy doesn't apply to pensioners. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a lie. That's an absolute lie, Mr. Speaker. Their pensioner guarantee is not worth the paper it's written on. Because if you were a pensioner before the 28th of March last year and then you set up a self-managed super fund after that date, you'll be affected by Labor's policy. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you were in a self-managed super fund before the 28th of March last year and you become a pensioner after that date, you'll be affected by Labor's policy. And there are around 50,000 Australian pensioners who are going to be affected by Labor's policy. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are many people who are hit by Labor's policy, including Alan from Ballina in the electorate of Richmond, Mr. Speaker. I'm a 76-year-old self-funded retiree, and my gross income has been slightly in excess of the income test for a full or partial age pension, and therefore I have not qualified for pensioner benefits. But as a result of Labor's policy, if it's adopted, I will lose $2,580 a year, Mr. Speaker. Now, that's real money to real people, Mr. Speaker. There's only one side of politics, and it's this side of politics, the Liberal and National parties in government under this Prime Minister, that will stand by retirees and not allow the Labor Party to hit them with a retirees tax.
Members on my right, Leader of the House, member for Wakefield and the Leader of the House. The member for Rankin has the call.
You don't.
Member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. It's reported that an Australian Foreign Affairs official expressed concerns about a potential conflict of interest after Joe Hockey directed embassy staff to meet with a subsidiary of Hello World, a company in which Mr Hockey has $1 million shareholding. When did this official first express concerns about Mr Hockey's conflict of interest? And will the Prime Minister undertake to table within 24 hours all relevant documents about this matter in this House?
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I represent the Minister for Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives, so I'll answer this question. Mr Speaker, the simple truth is that if there's been such a report, we never—
No, just before— no, I'm not satisfied with that. I mean, I need to—
Well, he's flicked it to me.
That's what I need to— Okay, that's fine. The Prime Minister has to...
Good. Happy to take the question,
Okay, well-
Prime Minister. We always check every single claim the Labor Party make about any sort of report, especially in the media, before we decide whether it's fact or not. That's been our tradition in this place. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister who represents the Minister for Foreign Affairs, we have every confidence in Joe Hockey as our ambassador in Washington, D.C. He is a former distinguished member of this House. He's a former distinguished treasurer who did a great deal more to get this economy back on track than any member of the Labor Party ever has, Mr. Speaker. And one of the reasons that we are reaping the benefits today of budget surpluses and a strong economy is because of the work that Joe Hockey did when he was a distinguished member of this House, Mr. Speaker. So the first point I would make is that we have every confidence in the integrity of Joe Hockey, our ambassador in Washington. The second point I would make is we have absolutely no confidence in the integrity of many members of the Labor Party over the many years that I've been in this place. And to be lectured by the Labor Party about fiscal rectitude, the party of Eddie Obeid, the party of Joe Tripodi, the party of Rex Jackson, if you want to go back a few decades, Mr. Speaker, the party of Craig Thompson, the party, Mr. Speaker, that required
Members on my left.
a royal commission to get out of the opposition a donation that he'd forgotten all about, Mr. Speaker. It took 8 years. The party of John Setka, Mr. Speaker, who they revere and put into a position of importance in the Labor Party. The party of Ian MacDonald. I mean, there were almost as many people in prison after the Keneally government as out of it, Mr. Speaker, from the Labor Party ministry. So, Mr. Speaker, we will not be lectured by the Labor Party about integrity or about fiscal rectitude in this place. And we all know what's going on here. The Prime Minister nailed it earlier. The Labor Party have had a shocker of a couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker. They thought the big story out of this fortnight would be the Canberra bubble, would be about votes in the House of Representatives, who was up and who was down, but it isn't, Mr. Speaker. The story out of this fortnight is that Labor is weak on border protection.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General provide an update to the House how weakened border protections will impact our justice system?
I haven't called you yet. The member for Lyons can leave under 94A. The Attorney-General has the call.
And I thank the member for his question. And the government's position has been very clear, and that is that Christmas Island is the appropriate response to the laws that Labor passed. And there are two essential reasons for that. The first is that under our government, the combination of policies of temporary protection visas, boat turn-backs and rigorous offshore processing has seen us get our borders under control, close 19 detention centres with the end effect that there are only a handful of onshore detention centres. Their capacity is constrained. Secondly, as the Minister for Home Affairs has pointed out, there are very real implications for our onshore justice system of transferring persons onto the mainland where we are aware that the person is charged or accused with a serious offence, or we have reasonable grounds to believe that they are of bad character. So Labor have passed laws that would require the transfer of hundreds of people onshore, removing the minister's discretion, and yet they themselves cannot agree as to where this onshore processing should occur. The opposition leader says Christmas Island is fine by me. The deputy leader of the opposition doesn't appear to share his enthusiasm or support for Christmas Island. The member for Corio says it's silly. So they've had 4 positions in 48 hours, that Christmas Island is unhinged and not supported, fine and supported, not fine, not supported, and not fine and silly. We have a very clear position that there is only one response. Their position would depend on who is the minister of the day, and that is curious because what now is revealed is that they go into a full election without letting the Australian people know who the minister they would have in charge of border protection would actually be. But don't worry, because the Leader of the Opposition assured us they have several good people. Well, maybe we should have a look at the front-runner at the moment, which is the member for Blair. And what he said yesterday provides a sobering reality check on what border protection would look like under members operate. The member for Blair said there is no difference between Labor and Liberal a shortened government will deploy the full force of the Ring of Steel, is what he said. Don't worry about border protection. The member of Blair is armed with his Ring of Steel. His hammer of Thor, his golden lasso, Mr Speaker. We can all rest, sleep fitfully at night because the member for Blair is there. What really is their policy over there? There have been three things. There have been three things that have kept our borders safe. Temporary protection visas. They are opposed to them. Offshore processing. They have now made that onshore processing on the instruction of doctors. The third thing is boat turnbacks. And what do they really think about boat turnbacks? Well, here's a little vignette from a previous immigration minister opposite. The member for McMahon, he said the evidence is overwhelming that turning back the boats is neither safe nor viable. But to be fair to the member for Blair, they did workshop Ring of Steel, and his preference was actually the semicircle of strongness, but that got dropped.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. 9 reports, and I quote, "In Mr Hockey's case, DFAT documents seen by The Age and Sydney Morning Herald show that he asked embassy staff to set up a meeting between Minister-Councillor Justin McPhillips, who oversees the Washington Embassy's operations, and an executive from Hello World subsidiary Qantas Business Travel. Does the Prime Minister deny such documents exist?"
Yeah, that's okay. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has asked about conflict of interest in that question. And, Mr Speaker, let me say this about conflict of interest. The Labor Party, since we got into power in 2013, have opposed every single attempt we've made to make the unions accountable in this country, Mr Speaker. The Australian Building and Construction Commission, the registered organisation—
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Point of order on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. The minister has referred to a part of the question that wasn't in the question.
Yeah, could just assist me. Do you mind just reading it again, because I missed the first couple of words?
The structure of it was question to the Prime Minister, 9 reports, and I quote. 9, right. That was then the quote, and the question was, does the Prime Minister deny such documents exist? That was what the member for Rankin asked.
Yeah, I'm just going to say to the Leader of the House that was a very tight and was a very tight question. When I sat the Leader of the House down, he had strayed beyond the subject matter of the question, but I call the Leader of the House. The member for Hotham is not assisting. The Leader of the House has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And if such documents exist and if such reports exist, I'm sure that we can find those things out when we actually investigate the efficacy of this question, Mr Speaker. And I'm not going to simply accept on face value that because the opposition says something, it makes it true, Mr Speaker. It never is. We see time and time again that in fact is not the case, that the Labor Party take long bows, exaggerations, use all sorts of means to try and twist the truth, and I've seen that for a quarter of a century in this place. So I'm hardly going to simply accept what the member for Rankin says and respond to it as though it's factual. But I was asked, I thought generally the question was an implication of conflict of interest, Mr Speaker. Conflict of interest of our ambassador in Washington, D.C. And as I said before, in my answer, the government has absolute confidence in our ambassador in Washington, D.C., and we're not going to take lectures from the Labor Party about integrity in politics. And as I said in my previous answer, Mr Speaker, which I'm referring to, the Labor Party has a very long charge sheet when it comes to inappropriate behaviour in state and the national parliaments.
Leader of the House will resume his seat. I've made it clear that the Leader of the House needs to relate his answer to the subject matter in the question. He was doing that just until that last 15 or 20 seconds. So I'm happy to call him again, or just move to the next question. Move to the next question. That sounds like a good idea. The member for Latrobe has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House how a strong economy and housing market benefits hard-working Australian families, including in my electorate of Latrobe? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches that would not deliver these benefits?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. And he knows the importance of Australia's $7 trillion residential housing market, a market that's absolutely critical to jobs through construction, a market that's absolutely critical to small business because many people in small business will mortgage the family home to invest and to grow their business. It's vitally important to the family balance sheet because for many families the greatest asset they'll ever own is the family home. And it's also important to have stability in the housing market to our AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker. Now, what puts at risk our AAA credit rating and what puts at risk the stability in the housing market is Labor's $32 billion new housing tax, Mr Speaker. A $32 billion new housing tax that will affect two-thirds of the people that it will impact who currently are negative gear. Two-thirds of those have a taxable income under $87,000, Mr Speaker. Now, 1.3 million people currently negative gear. Now, these are not wealthy people. These people have put aside a little bit of money every month so that they can make an investment, like Robert and Cassia, both of whom are 31 years of age. They live in Cranbourne North, in Melbourne's southeast. They said they plucked up the courage to buy a two-bedroom apartment at the time that their first daughter was born. Their net rental loss is around $5,000 a year. Together they earn around $160,000 a year. He's in IT, she's in sales. Now, Mr Speaker, they said the theory is not to sell the apartment anytime soon and get it when we're young enough so that when we retire we can completely pay it off. Negative gearing makes it a more financially viable option. Now, Mr Speaker, these are among the many people across Australia who will see the value of their investments go down as a result of Labor's policy. And what is more, anybody who owns their own home in Australia will see it worth less under Labor's new housing tax, and anyone who rents their house will end up paying more under Labor's housing tax. In fact, there are more than 2 million Australians aged 20 to 34 who currently rent, and they will be hit with a new housing tax and higher rents as a result of the Labor Party's policy. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party should have listened to the member for Louis when he was the last time when he was Treasurer, who said it would be economically disastrous to touch negative gearing. Now, Mr Speaker, now the member for McMahon, as part of his $200 billion of new taxes, is going to take a sledgehammer to people's housing prices and going to increase rents. Only the coalition can be trusted to keep taxes low.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister confident that trips like the one by the Minister for Home Affairs and Joe Hockey with Hello World CEO and Liberal Treasurer Mr Andrew Burns to Las Vegas were paid at the full commercial rate?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Again, Mr Speaker, the member comes here and just makes assertions. He makes
Members
assertions,
on my left.
and then he asks me to respond as if those assertions are true, Mr Speaker. No, he's not asking. It's said to me, how dare he ask a question? No, he's not asking a question. He's making an assertion about something he hasn't even established as a fact. And on that basis, Mr Speaker, I don't agree necessarily with the presumption of the question, and therefore on what basis should I allow a member to come and just simply come to the dispatch box, cast aspersions on people in this chamber, the other chamber, former members of the chamber, simply because the Labor Party wants to distract attention from the fact that they have come into this place and undermine Australia's border protection regime? Mr Speaker, we know, because they've been boasting around the media for some time, that they have had this little issue for some time in the drawer, and when the pressure's on, they pull it out. Well, Mr Speaker, I think the public can see this for what it is. It's just smear.
Resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded? The Prime Minister's concluded. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the success of the government's border security policies, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches to border protection that may jeopardise the sovereignty of Australia's borders?
The Minister for Immigration.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. So we know about Labor's law to end offshore processing that was so shamefully passed through the House last week. We know that under Labor that 8,000 children were forcibly placed in detention. It's true. It's true. 8,000 children were forcibly placed in detention. That's what you did. We know that under Labor,
now warned.
We know that under Labor, tragically, 1,200 people drowned at sea. Now let's go through this law to end offshore processing, of which we learn more and more. First thing is, we know that under Labor, the doctors don't have to be based in the same country as the patient. They can be in Dapto, Devonport or Dungog. Question for Labor: why? We know that under Labor's law, Mr Speaker, the people who are to be transferred don't even have to be sick. The doctors merely have to state that they should come to Australia for an assessment. Why? Why is that what in Labor's law? We also know that under Labor's law, the minister has no power to stop a referral unless someone is in breach of the ASIO Act or has been to jail for 12 months. Now, that is Labor's Amendment 14. They chose it. They actually wrote it down, Mr Speaker. They wrote down, got out a pen and wrote down, unless they breach the ASIO Act or they've been to 12 months, they can come to Australia and there's nothing the government can do to stop it. That's what the shadow minister did. That's what the other government, that's what the opposition did. They also say in their bill, Mr Speaker, that one doctor can order an unlimited number of people, to come to Australia, and unless the person is in breach of the ASIO Act or has been jailed for 12 months, there's nothing the government can do to stop it. Extraordinary, Mr Speaker, and they must be accountable for all these questions. And now, Mr Speaker, this morning the shadow minister said the legislation applies to people currently in Manus and Nauru. Turns out that's wrong too, Mr Speaker, because, Mr Speaker, in the legislation the Labor Party have defined what's known as a relevant transitory person. And, Mr Speaker, that includes people who have already resettled in Papua New Guinea, Mr Speaker, who are not even on Manus Island. There are 58 people, Mr Speaker, who have resettled in Papua New Guinea, who have been granted refugee visas by Papua New Guinea, who are not on Manus Island at all. Under this law, Mr Speaker, they can access the medical transfer provisions, and I am advised, Mr Speaker, that they are already seeking to do so. 58 people who are not on Manus Island at all. The shadow minister clearly does not understand the legislation which he so shamefully passed through this parliament, and it just goes to show what happens when political opportunism trumps national security and trumps sensible governance.
It's a disgraceful. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House, 1, notes that yesterday it was revealed the Finance Minister received free flights to Singapore from Hello World, which he booked by calling the CEO of this ASX-listed company directly, just before it was awarded a multi-million-dollar whole-of-government contract by the minister's own department. B, today it's been reported that US Ambassador Joe Hockey, who has $1 million shareholding in Hello World, helped a Hello World subsidiary lobby for the embassy's travel contract. C, the CEO of Hello World and one of its largest shareholders, Andrew Burns, is a Liberal Party heavyweight and current Liberal Party treasurer, with connections to a number of Liberal Party politicians. D, the Finance Minister told Senate estimates yesterday that he had a, quote, a close personal relationship with Mr Burns. E, Mr Burns was previously a colleague of the now Prime Minister during the Prime Minister's time at Tourism Australia. F, since being awarded government contracts, the share price of Hello World has skyrocketed, making shareholders like Mr Hockey and Mr Burns rich. And G, this morning it was reported that the Herald Sun asked almost all of the 82 Liberal MPs in Parliament whether they had received free travel from Hello World but only 14 said that they had not. And 2, therefore, calls on the Prime Minister to investigate and report to the House how far this Hello World scandal reaches into his government.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would prevent the member for Rankin from moving the following motion immediately. That the House, 1, notes that yesterday it was revealed the Finance Minister received free flights to Singapore from Hello World, which he booked by calling the CEO of this ASX-listed company directly, just before it was awarded a multi-million-dollar whole-of-government contract by the minister's own department. B, today it's been reported that US Ambassador Joe Hockey, who has a $1 million shareholding in Hello World, helped a Hello World subsidiary lobby for the embassy's travel contract. C, the CEO of Hello World and one of its largest shareholders, Andrew Burns, is a Liberal Party heavyweight and current Liberal Party treasurer with connections to a number of Liberal Party politicians. D, the Finance Minister told Senate estimates yesterday that he had a, quote, close personal relationship with Mr Burns. E, Mr Burns was previously a colleague of the now Prime Minister during the Prime Minister's time at Tourism Australia. F, since being awarded government contracts, the share price of Hello World has skyrocketed, making shareholders like Mr Hockey and Mr Burns rich. And G, this morning it was reported that the Herald Sun asked almost all of the 82 Liberal MPs in Parliament whether they had received free travel from Hello World, but only 14 said that they had not. And 2, therefore, calls on the Prime Minister to investigate and report to the House how far this Hello World scandal reaches into his government. Mr Speaker, these are very serious issues that we are raising in the parliament. They are far too serious to be dismissed and to be laughed off and to be ignored by this arrogant and out-of-touch government. This is a very Liberal scandal that we're dealing with. It has all of the stink and all of the stench of a very Liberal scandal. It's got all of the mates at the top end of town, all the insider deals that lock out ordinary working people, all of the ingredients of what we've come to expect from this government opposite, which always governs for the top end of town at the expense of people who work and struggle in this country. It's a very, very Liberal scandal. And what we've seen today in this House is the alternative universe that those opposite inhabit. The alternative universe where it's entirely normal, when you want to book the 3:30 flight out of Perth, you ring up the CEO of an ASX-listed company. That's the alternative universe that they live in. The alternative universe which says that you don't actually notice when somebody else picks up a $3,000 tab for you. You don't notice that it hasn't come out of your credit card. The alternative universe that those opposite occupy, where there is one set of rules for their rich Liberal Party mates and another set of rules for ordinary Australians in communities that we represent right around this country. Now, there are so many things today, Mr Speaker, that the Prime Minister and his sidekick, his offsider, the member for Sturt, were unable to explain. So many things that they were unable to explain. They couldn't provide a simple answer to a simple question about whether the documents which prove that Mr Hockey asked one of the embassy officials to take a meeting with the company at the centre of this scandal, whether or not that document exists. And when the member for Sturt was asked about this, he basically told the House, look, when we get around to checking it out, we'll see how we go. Well, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. The Australian people deserve answers about this latest grubby scandal which is engulfing the government which sits opposite from us today. There are so many aspects to this, but perhaps the one that the Prime Minister needs to explain from his own answers today, I think. There's a lot of explaining to do from the Prime Minister. There's a lot of explaining that he needs to do. But he said today, and he scurried out of the House, he's gone and hidden his office, but he said today, and I quote, "I'm advised Mr Hockey did not instruct staff to meet QBT or any other companies in relation to the tender and as part of normal business." And what the Prime Minister needs to explain when he speaks, when he next speaks, or when the member for Sturt does, is that he is claiming that Mr Hockey didn't request embassy staff to meet with QBT at all. Now, this is a very serious issue here. This is a very serious issue. The Prime Minister is denying something of which there are reports of documents which exist from officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. That is a very, very serious matter, Mr Speaker, and that's why we need to suspend standing orders to get to the bottom of these very, very important issues. Now, everybody in this House and everybody who has followed this scandal knows where it began. It began with the Minister for Finance booking the 3:30 out of Perth or whatever it was by ringing the CEO of a company, not understanding when a $3,000 bill was paid by someone else, despite the fact that those opposite, they're all chasing people on government payments, aren't they? They all notice. They notice when every cent that goes into a recipient's account, don't they? But $3,000 doesn't come out of the Finance Minister's account, and that's no big deal. That's the alternative universe that those opposite occupy, as I said a moment ago. So we know where this scandal began, but we don't yet know where it ends. We don't yet know where it ends. And I don't think they know where it ends yet either. There's a lot more questions to be asked and there's a lot more questions to be answered. And I think what really gave it away in question time today was when we started asking about the travel arrangements between Mr Burns and others, the ashen faces. The ashen faces. Right along the front bench. All these people hoping that the next question wasn't to them. All of these people desperately hoping that the next question wasn't going to be to them. I saw it. The member for Flinders, I thought, was particularly revealing. I'd love to know more about that. But we'll get to all of that. We'll get to all of that, Deputy Speaker, in due course. We will get to all of those questions. Now, those opposite have started talking a lot about a chum bucket, haven't they? They've started talking a lot about a chum bucket. And what this scandal, which I'm going to call Chumgate, because Chumgate involves so many Liberal Party chums, doesn't it? So many Liberal Party chums are involved in Chumgate, right up and down the front bench and beyond, all the way up into the cheap seats. There's a lot of chums involved in this scandal. And we're going to get to the bottom of Chumgate, aren't we? We're going to get to the bottom of this scandal because the only difference between a chum bucket and the Liberal Party is the bucket itself. There's a lot of chums involved in this scandal. And time won't permit me, Deputy Speaker, going to all the other reasons why this is important, but just think about it for a moment. Even in the last few months, when we're talking about the awarding of big government contracts, they just can't help themselves, can they? No. $500 million to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation that they didn't ask for, $500 million to the Paladin Group, which is registered to a beach shack on Kangaroo Island or some such. They just can't help themselves. They can't get it right, and yet they want us to trust them to make a good decision on offshore visa processing. And when the Prime Minister's own friend is intimately involved in one of the bids, we know how this movie ends, don't we? We know how they work on that. We know how they roll on that side of the House, don't we, when it comes to the awarding of big government contracts, and the Australian people are very worried about it. Now, while all this is going on, while this Liberal government goes out of their way to look after their mates at the top end of town, the Australian people just don't get a look in. They don't get a look in. And just today, as the Shadow Treasurer and others, the Shadow Employment Minister, have talked about, no doubt, we've got a wages figure out today, 0.5%, annual 2.3%. We've got in this country historically low wages growth. We've got stagnant wages. People aren't getting a look in. They aren't getting rewarded for their work. We've got stagnant wages. We've got all kinds of things. Everything's going up except for wages. We've got childcare costs up, power bills up, private health care costs up. People are underemployed. People are insecure at work. And those opposites spend all their time working out how they can work the angle, little insider deals for their rich Liberal Party mates, and doesn't that just say everything about those opposite? If only those opposites spent as much time caring about insecure work or stagnant wages as they spend trying to do insider deals for rich Liberal Party mates, the whole country would be better off. The whole country would be better off. And that's what this is about. That's what this is about at the end of the day. This is a government which is so horrendously out of touch. Their priorities are so warped that when we get a wages number like we did today and we have been getting for some months, when we get all the things about insecure work and underemployment, falling consumer confidence, bad business conditions, all of these things that really matter in the Australian economy, what are they up to? What are they up to? Flying around on free flights, ringing up their mates, getting insider deals, doing deals, awarding big government contracts to people that they are intimately involved with in the Liberal Party. So that's why standing orders need to be suspended, Deputy Speaker. We know where this began, but we don't yet know where it ends, and we are going to pursue it until the Australian people get the answers that they need and deserve.
Is the motion seconded? I call the member for Isaacs.
The motion is seconded and I reserve my right to speak.
I call the question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the Leader of the House.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and of course the government will not be agreeing to the suspension of standing orders. Mr Speaker, that was really one of the weakest performances I've seen in this place in a very long time. This is the man who's apparently the great white hope of the Queensland right wing, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin. But his performance was enough to make himself cry, Mr Speaker. As we know has been the case before in the past when he hasn't been able to get his own way, Mr Speaker, as was exposed by the previous Prime Minister, Mr Rudd. This is one of the weakest cases I've ever seen in this House, Mr Speaker, to condemn either a minister or, in this case, the ambassador to Washington DC. It is a straight-out smear and a straight-out slur, Mr Speaker. And what the Labor Party have been saying in the press gallery all day today, to anybody who wanted to hear, bragging about how they've had this story for months. They've known about the Hello World story for a long time, and they were just waiting to drop it to distract from their own problems, Mr Speaker, to distract from their woes, which they've created themselves in the last few weeks. They thought they were coming back to Canberra. They thought they were going to have the government on toast, Mr Speaker, because they completely mistake the fact that the Canberra bubble is not the Australian public. No. That is not what the people of Australia are talking about, Mr Speaker. They're not fussed about whether the government doesn't get enough votes for an absolute majority to stop a suspension of standing orders or to pass it. They couldn't care less about that, Mr Speaker. What they're talking about in the suburbs and the main streets of Australia are the retirees tax, are the housing tax, are the $200 billion of taxes that the Labor Party wants to inflict on the Australian economy, on small businesses, on the couples and individuals that the Treasurer has been outlining in question time today and yesterday. They are frightened of a Labor government getting into power, Mr Speaker. They are frightened of a Labor government getting into power because pensioners and retirees have fixed incomes, and when they get to that stage of their life, they work out precisely their standard of living, how they're going to be able to live. They put a little bit aside for their grandchildren for Christmas and birthdays. They put a bit aside for their caravan and camping trips. They put a bit aside for charities, Mr Speaker. And if you talk to almost any person who's on board of a charity in Australia, they'll tell you that if they look at the breakdown of their donations to their charity, there are a huge number of small amounts of money, $50, $100, $200 donated by older, $25 donated by older Australians, retirees and pensioners who think that because they live in the greatest country in the world and because they've done well and they've been able to look after themselves in their retirement, they should give something back to a charity. And they will be the first expenses to go, Mr Speaker, because of Labor's retiree tax. Now, let's just turn to this issue itself, this pathetic case that was put by the member for Rankin. The facts are, Mr Speaker, the ambassador in Washington declared his shareholding in Hello World before the tender process for the Australian Embassy in Washington Travel Services commenced. The tender process commenced with a register for expressions of interest advertised in August 2018. Mr Hockey has had no role in the tender process. He declared his business interests in accordance with the DFAT guidelines. The Australian Embassy staff meeting with QBT on the 26th of April 2017 was not in relation to the tender process. QBT was then and continues to be a travel provider for DFAT through whole-of-government supplier arrangements. Mr Hockey declared his business interests in Hello World to embassy staff ahead of that meeting. He did not instruct staff to meet QBT or any other companies in relation to the tender. As part of the normal business, Australian Embassy staff have met and corresponded with a range of travel providers to discuss the embassy's travel requirements. They are the facts, Mr Speaker. And Hello World has put out a statement today to the Australian Stock Exchange, not to The Guardian, not to the ABC, not to the Fairfax Press, not to the Labor Party machine men who are trying to distract the Australian public from their complete failure on border protection and taxes. No, to the Australian Stock Exchange. So there's a very high standard required if you declare something to the Australian Stock Exchange. Well, I'll tell you what they declared. They said, at no time has Ambassador Hockey or Hello World CEO Andrew Burns discussed the DFAT tender, and neither Mr Hockey nor Mr Burns have had any involvement in the tender process. Mr Burns did not request the meeting with DFAT personnel in the United States, Mr Speaker. So it's absolutely clear that what Labor has tried to do is come up with a farrago of lies, a tissue campaign to try and create a smear and a slur and distract the people from the real issues that are coming at this next election. And the real issues at the next election are, who do you trust to run the Australian economy? Who do you trust to deliver a budget surplus, one that Labor's never delivered since 1989? Who do you trust on border protection to protect our borders so that the ADF doesn't have to work on the jobs in the northern reaches protecting our borders, but can actually get on with the job that they're trained for? Who do you trust to deliver the services that Australians expect and the infrastructure that they require in a modern economy? And it isn't the Labor Party. It is the Liberal and National parties, the parties that have a very clear record over many decades of fixing the messes that Labor creates when they unfortunately get the chance to be in government. It happened with the Whitlam government. It happened with the Keating and Hawke government. It happened with the Rudd and Gillard governments. And it's very important, Mr Speaker, that this election is decided on the issues that matter to people in the street, in the main streets of the country towns and the suburbs of Australia, not inside this Canberra bubble which the Labor Party revel in and the Australian people don't give two hoots about, Mr Speaker. Finally, Mr Speaker, it is the height of audacity for the Labor Party to try and lecture the Liberal and National Party about fiscal rectitude and integrity, Mr Speaker. It took a royal commission for the Leader of the Opposition to declare donations of very high value that he'd suddenly forgotten about as soon as he received them. Now, we've all been in campaigns. We all know how to raise money. Tens of thousands of dollars are a very large donation. Well, I'm always happy when I get a $500 donation, Mr Speaker, from a small business person who wants to stop the Labor Party getting into office. But tens of thousands of dollars is a very significant donation, but the member for Maribyrnong forgot all about it, Mr Speaker. And it took 8 years and a royal commission for the Leader of the Opposition to be forced to declare what is required of every member of this House and the political parties that we represent. So we're not going to be lectured by the member for Maribyrnong about these kinds of issues of financial integrity. We're not going to be lectured by the Labor Party that the Keneally government ended up with almost as many people in prison in the ministry as out of it, Mr Speaker, at the end of their government. Ian MacDonald, Joe Tripodi, Eddie Obeid, of course not all of those have gone to prison. These people were exposed by ICAC for the most heinous activities when they were in government in the New South Wales government, Mr Speaker. And you'd like that all to be forgotten because you've got a New South Wales election coming up in a few weeks' time, Mr Speaker. A few weeks' time you've got a New South Wales election. But if you want to put integrity back on the political agenda in New South Wales, go right ahead, Mr Speaker, because the Berejiklian government would love to have that debate reheated about Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi and Ian MacDonald. And of course there's the relationship with the union movement, with people like John Setka and the CFMMEU and Joe MacDonald. I mean, Kevin Rudd turned his back on unions like that. Kevin Rudd threw Joe MacDonald out of the Labor Party. The current Leader of the Opposition has brought all of those people, Mr Speaker, into the centre of decision-making in the Labor Party. They're deciding on pre-selections, who should sit in this place. They're deciding on policy. In Victoria, they were brought in to give the Leader of the Opposition the numbers he needed for himself and his faction to take over the Victorian Labor Party, to elect people like the member for Corio, who's had a big run in the park today, I'm not sure he'll get such a big run again in the future after he decided to put 55,000 jobs in Queensland and elsewhere at risk in the mining and resources sector by saying he wanted the mining and resources sector to collapse internationally, Mr Speaker, in order to apparently protect the climate. So the Labor Party had a shocker in the last fortnight, Mr Speaker. They've had a shocker.
Yeah.
The cockiness of the Labor Party in the last 6 to 12 months, they were so certain they were going to be in the ministerial wing. Well, we're very much looking forward to the election. We believe the Australian public will want to re-elect a government that delivers budget surpluses, low taxes and more jobs.
The question is that the motion moved by the member for Rankin be agreed to. I call the member for Isaacs.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. Standing orders should be suspended to enable this motion to be moved, because we do need to know just how deep in it is this government, how deep in the Hello World scandal. This coalition government are only in it for themselves. Today we've had more shocking revelations concerning the Hello World scandal. Not only is the current Finance Minister, Senator Cormann, knee-deep in this mess, but also the former Treasurer, now Ambassador to the United States. That's the same Mr Hockey who famously declared in 2014 that with the election of the Abbott government the, quote, age of entitlement was over. Well, it's well and truly alive with this government, particularly the government front bench, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister did not go close in his answers in question time to justifying the reported conduct of Mr Hockey as our ambassador to the United States. According to the Leader of the House, they have not even begun to investigate the allegations that have appeared in the media. And let's be clear about this. Mr Hockey is one of the 20 largest shareholders in the relevant company, one of the 20 largest shareholders, over $1 million worth of shares. And I just want to go back to what the Prime Minister has claimed in question time. The Leader of the House repeated this same claim. I'll read it out. I'm advised Mr Hockey did not instruct staff to meet QBT or any other companies in relation to the tender and as part of normal business. Well, I'm sorry to say that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the House have been misadvised. I'm going to read from the correspondence from Embassy staff, which the Prime Minister should bring into the House tomorrow, if he's actually caring at all about probity in government or caring at all about advising this House properly. This is what the correspondence from Embassy staff says. Ambassador Hockey has asked that I set up a meeting while you are in Washington on Wednesday. Would you be available at 10:30 a.m? Hopefully the ambassador can join the meeting, but the Minister-Counsellor, Justin McPhillips, who's in charge of the administration at the embassy, will definitely meet with you. If you could advise the names of all those who will come to the meeting, I will advise security. As my colleagues behind me are saying, oops! And it's actually something that the Prime Minister now needs to actually investigate. Let's think for a moment about Senator Cormann in the other place, who accidentally, he claims, took a free flight with his family to Singapore and failed to notice that his credit card hadn't been charged, who pretends that it's totally normal to call up the CEO of a company in order to book your personal travel. Please. Senator Cormann says he's a friend. Well, it's the same CEO, this friend, who is the federal treasurer of the Liberal Party, the same friend, the same CEO, who's donated more than $500,000 to the Liberal Party, and the same CEO whose company's share price has soared, 170% increase, I'm told, since the company started to receive government contracts. And this government has form. This government has plenty of form. Let's think about the member for Dixon, who's happy to dole out visas to au pairs for his mates and continues to ignore very serious constitutional eligibility questions about himself, stemming from taxpayers' subsidies from his own family childcare business. The Leader of the House reckons I might run out of material. No risk of that. There is plenty. Let's talk about the member for Fadden, who used his previous ministerial office to help a Liberal donor on a big deal in China. He lost his job for that under former Prime Minister Turnbull, but he's back. He's been rewarded with the role of Assistant Treasurer by his flatmate, the Prime Minister, not to mention the $40,000 home internet bill. Then we could talk about Senator McKenzie, who happened to buy an apartment while on taxpayer-funded travel entitlements. And who could forget the former Speaker, Bronwyn Bishop, and her helicopter ride? And it's not surprising the backbench are following their lead, Mr Speaker. Just look at the member for Goldstein and his conduct as chair of the House Economics Committee, or the current member for Dunkley, who used his position as a Member of Parliament to spruik a company he subsequently bought shares in. We definitely need to suspend standing orders. The PM needs to come clean on just how far this scandal reached.
And the time allotted for this debate has concluded. The question is that the motion moved by the member for Rankin be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Aye. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion moved by the member for Rankin be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. Put the honourable members for Morton and Lawler tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Murray and Gray tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, noes 71. However, given the motion is not carried by an absolute majority as required by Standing Order 47, I see no point in exercising my casting vote. The motion fails as a result. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice plate.